Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest of the RGE Open Channel facilitated discussions done with Gas Safe Register on a variety of topics of interest to engineers. Today we are looking at the latest update to the Unsafe Situations Guidance, so G11. And to have a look at that as a topic, I'm joined by my colleague Rob Denman from Gas Safe Register, our head of technical, joined by Ian McCluskey of IGEM, by Dave Bendel, who is chair of the Unsafe Sits panel, and by Trevor Smallpiece, panel member and part of the Standards Consultation Forum. So we'll have a look at various areas on this latest updates to come out on Unsafe Sits. Just as we proceed, just a reminder, we're broadcasting this is a facilitated chat. We try and keep an eye on any questions that come through, but if we're not able to get to any questions that are submitted live, we do always mop them up, and we do have a look at anything on there, and we use that material to pull together any subsequent briefing or any subsequent material in Registered Gas Engineer magazine. So we'll do that. The discussion's half an hour tonight, so we're running from 6:30 until 7 o'clock tonight. Unsafe Sits is obviously quite a big topic, so I don't imagine we'll be able to get through all aspects of it, but hopefully we'll give it a good go. And as I say, any detail work or any detailed points to follow up, we'll do that in the magazine. So with that in mind, I just wanted to say to Dave particularly, as you're chair of the Unsafe Sits panel, what is it? Give first principles. What is G11 and why is it important to engineers?
Well, G11, as you said, is the IGEM publication, a guidance document that we like to refer to as the Unsafe Sits for short. Now, all employees, regardless of what manner of work you undertake, bound by the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is just a piece of legislation that says you need to manage the risks that you create to keep yourself and your customers safe. And that applies to all trades. We're fortunate that in the gas industry, we've got the Gas Safety Installation and Use Regulations. Again, another piece of legislation, but this sort of brings managing the risk down to specifics for gas engineers. And part of that, as you go through the gas safety regs, is that you must notify customers of unsafe situations, bring it to their attention. And that's legislation, that's a requirement. The Unsafe Sits is a guidance document to assist you in being compliant with that requirement. So it gives you some, hopefully, common sense advice, easy to follow, based on a series of principles. And most of those are laid out in figure 1, the initial flowchart in the document, which very basically says, if you're going to turn it on and it's going to immediately harm someone, it's immediately dangerous, as the name implies. If it's not right, but not likely to immediately harm you, but you're concerned, it probably falls into the at-risk category. And those are the base principles the whole document's written on. What we've tried to do is create a document for use by trained and competent operatives. You know, there was a danger that the Unsafe Sits has almost become a gas fitting by numbers, a paint by numbers book. It says this, we must do that. As with everything, the man on site is the ultimately responsible person, and he has a unique set of circumstances in front of him. We can't sort of cover every eventuality in a document, so we've tried to give the basic guidance principles with some common examples. So hopefully that sums up what it is.
Thank you, Dave. That's the piece that I think it's always worth reinforcing, and it'll come up, I know, later in the conversation, that the supporting materials that are out there for engineers are just that. They are there to support the decision making of the engineer on site at any given time. It's not about giving them the answer, because these are the qualified professionals who are there and having a look at it. But just before we move on to looking at what the major differences are in this particular, this new edition of it, I think it's useful to get an idea of how the document comes together, because I think, again, there are some misapprehensions from engineers about who who owns the document, who gets to feed into it, who decides on these things. Trevor, could you give us just an introduction point on how the document comes together in each iteration of it?
Okay, well, the document comes together really through industry consultation. All the people who sit on the panel cover various parts of the industry, and we actually pull all information together that we gather, and we can talk a little bit about that a little bit later, together to try and form, as Dave said, a sort of a robust way of an engineer being able to make a risk assessment on the situation. Now, the document really is, one might say now, is owned by IGEM because it's an IGEM document, and it's free to industry, and it's free to industry through GasSafe website, and it's free through IGEM website. So I think there is misconceptions about how and who makes the decisions on what is put into the document. As I say, it's really all fed up from engineers, Scott, and that is the general idea. It's trying to look at what engineers will genuinely find on site and how they will best deal with that. And as Dave said, this is a guidance to help them risk assess those situations. I'm not sure if I've covered exactly what you was asking for, but giving it a go.
Oh, always, Trevor. Rob, just in terms of how we feed into it, because again, sometimes I think there are misapprehensions about just where our role sits in these things, and the register is very much as a panel member, as a contributor to pulling together this material. But I think we're in a unique position that particularly the technical team or the inspectors in the field have direct access to engineers in terms of pulling those things in. So how do we distill the points that we see, or the areas where there's maybe clarity being sought, or there perhaps been some misinterpretation, or even on emerging issues?
Okay, so yes, I sit on the G11 panel representing the register, and we do get lots of information from different sources. So we do receive feedback from registered engineers when they're implementing the guidance, but equally from our own inspectors on issues they're having interpreting the document. So what I do is this is all collated, and what we do is we review it and we feed that back through the G11 panel when it meets. On top of this, we've got access to the statistical information from our field inspections, from complaints, from WIDOR notifications, the number, the type, frequency of unsafe situations that we're finding. And again, this is also useful information when we meet back up as a panel to look at what needs to be changed. And as we've already touched on today, sometimes what we wrote is not how it's being interpreted. So unless people write in, ring us up, discuss things with us, we're not aware of these things that are causing conflict out there. So feedback from engineers who use a document is absolutely vital. Like any document, it has to grow and reflect the challenges that people are finding out there.
Fantastic. And Ian, from an IGEM perspective, IGEM ultimately is the owners of the document, where everyone feeds through. You have a nice helicopter view on these things. Where do IGEM fit into that? It's more than just collating the comments. You're obviously feeding in through your own sources as well.
Absolutely. So we particularly will form the expert panel that Dave chairs, and through that panel make sure there's the wide balance of representation across the industry, from those practicing engineers who are involved day to day with the work, and of course with GasSafe Register and the Health and Safety Executive ever present on the panel. We get those views coming through. What's extremely important, and something Trevor touched on, was the key stakeholder groups as well. And we bring together all of the key stakeholder groups that are working in the downstream sector. We're able to feed in those comments. And in particular, when we're drafting the document, the way the IGEM documents are drafted, it's through a rigor and a robust governance process that relies on those peer review discussions happening within the expert panel when subjects are brought together for debate and discussion, so we can form the best advice. But we don't rely on that. We, particularly once we've formed the responses, we'll send out to industry comment, as we did last year with this particular revision, to seek a wider comment for those engineers who are going to be using it. It goes out for public comment, and they can have an opportunity to feed in through that process any comments that they'd like to raise, any areas of concern that they've got, or anything they think we may have actually got wrong. and the drafting of the updated edition. And those comments are all taken seriously. We bring them back to the expert working group, who laboriously will go through every comment, and it's quite an important process to make sure that every comment is looked at, is addressed, and it's fed back into the final version for the document, is then published as a final revision. It'll go through an IGEM committee structure to make sure the governance process has been followed, and then it becomes a final published document.
Thank you, Ian. I hope that's been useful in terms of setting out some of the general principles on why the document exists and what it's for, and go some way to explaining how everyone can feed in, because everyone can feed in to that. It's just a question of finding the most efficient routes to do that, to make sure it's done in a coordinated and more effective way. I think the key bit we wanted to do in this session is we actually wanted to look at the meat of this particular update and have a look at the particular content. So we wanted to have a look at some of the areas where the core messaging still sits, whether that has changed or evolved or updated in any way, or as Trevor said earlier, sometimes clarified the original intentions of what we always thought was already in there, but might not have been interpreted as intended. Any technical changes, legislative changes. So Dave, do you want to take us through what are the key updates, or what are the key elements of this update, whether they be new or whether they are just reinforcements of what was already in there?
I guess it's a mix of all of those. Changes is probably a little too strong. Quite often they're more updates, because this document evolves. We've got to remember it's been around for 20 odd years now, and we'd like to think it's always been a good document. We just improve as time goes on and situations change. So I guess as a chair, I'm very fortunate. As we've alluded to, I'm surrounded by representatives from across industry that not only deal with workforces of their own so as they can get feedback, they have a number of touch points across the industry gaining feedback as well that helps us bring in. And one of the key things that was being picked up at the time when we were reviewing the document was shall we say, a misunderstanding or lack of knowledge as to the requirements of RIDDOR, the reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrence regulations, which a lot of people would think sits, hand in glove with the unsafe sits, but they are sort of distinct and separate requirements. You've got the gas safety regs on one side requiring you to notify responsible persons of unsafe situations, but then separate legislation from HSE is RIDDOR, which requires you to notify HSE of situations which may cause death, unconsciousness, or a person being taken to hospital that are caused by certain gas situations. And they do link together quite closely, but they're not an exact match. An ID situation isn't necessarily always RIDDOR reportable. And so we've tried to clarify that in the document and give engineers a reasonable understanding of what the requirements of RIDDOR are. This isn't a RIDDOR guidance document per se, but we need to point them in the right direction. And that's for the protection of themselves as well as their customers, because they have a requirement to complete RIDDORs. So we tried to give some sensible guidance there, reaffirming what the criteria of RIDDOR is, and that's looking at the outcome. So has it led, or is it likely to lead to a death, unconsciousness, or a person being taken to hospital? And if those are a possibility, RIDDOR it. But of course, that left a bit of a hole then. What about the bits that sort of sit on the edge, and the engineer's a little bit concerned that, for want of a better expression, he's got some guilty knowledge of a job that's not quite right, but perhaps doesn't fit into those quite strict guidelines from RIDDOR. And so we worked with yourselves at Gas Safe Register in trying to make the reporting of unsafe workmanship easier. And so again, in the document, there's a section on how to report unsafe workmanship to the register so as it can be properly investigated and action taken as appropriate. That involved, it sounds like a simple thing. It's just a web link in the document, but there's a lot goes on behind the scenes in making sure that that process becomes as slick as possible. So they're quite significant updates in clarifying RIDDOR, what should and shouldn't be reported, but also then filling the void for those things that might have been being incorrectly reported under RIDDOR to make sure that they're not lost. Because, you know, we're rightly proud of this very safe industry we have, but we still need to know about things that aren't done properly so as we can act on them and learn from them. So 2 major changes there, RIDDOR and reporting through the gas safe register. There is what I would say is a helpful flowchart, an appendix in the back of the document that will assist an engineer on deciding what reporting route a situation would take. We've taken the opportunity as well to try and clarify some of the examples, situations in the tables. We tended to get a lot of noise around missing screws in flues or fixing of flues. And the trouble is in being in any panel when you debate everything to the nth degree is you know what you think it says. But when you send that out to 140,000 registered operatives, they might read it slightly differently. And you know, that feedback came back. And what we've tried doing is, again, trying to move away from this where I'm saying paint by numbers, as I call it, but if Unsafe says it's at risk, it must be at risk. No, the engineer is the person on site that can make a risk assessment. And this is trying to guide him, but to offer some greater guidance, we've reworded some of the examples. And I come back to this screw-in flue. You know, if the manufacturer says it needs 6 and it's only got 5, well, it's not right in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, but is it likely to become unsafe? So we've tried to say we've got to look at the potential outcome. Is there likely to be a breach in the integrity of that flue? If the answer is yes, then it's at risk. If it's not, it's poor workmanship, but it's not necessarily an unsafe situation. So we've just tried refining a number of the examples to give a little better steer to assist the engineer with his risk assessment making. We've also taken, and we mentioned members of the group, we work very closely with HSE, and HSE are a group member. One of the examples was about clipping pipe work or supporting pipe work, you know, and we're trying to move away from this example where the British standard says the pipe must be clipped every 1.2 meters. You say, well, what if you've got a piece of pipe that's only 1 meter long? That means you don't need any clips. You know, and it's again trying in the examples to say you need to think about the likely outcome. With it being unsupported, is there a possibility it could get damaged, lose its integrity? So there's been some subtle rewording of a number of the scenarios in the tables. There's an entire new piece in the document in theft of gas, something we'd not considered previously, but was raised by our colleagues in metering. Said, where would an engineer go if he's got suspicion? Because sometimes that's theft of gas, bypassing a meter, whatever, could be overtly unsafe. And we're covered that way. But what would an engineer do if he's concerned? Would there be a reporting mechanism? So there's a new paragraph in there detailing who to call and inform. Because although it might not be the most natural fit, because some of these people have a great knack of sort of meter or gas theft without making an unsafe situation, but it's not right and it needs to be reported. And there was no easy go-to point for an engineer. That's in there now. We've also just tweaked some of the wording because we have to move with the times to cover how we might use electronic recording and reporting of unsafe situations and their associated warning notices, letters, just to make sure the text in the document reflects the fact that that technology currently exists. You know, we were a little bit perhaps back in the dark ages with paper, pens and hard copy when the document was last written. So it's reflecting that a bit. And then we've got a few pieces in trying to pull the industry together. There was some feedback about how quite often the emergency service provision was seen as the panacea to all awkward things. So if you just phone up because the customer's refusing a disconnection on ID, the networks will take care of it. And we're saying they will, they're very good at it. But this whole process would be much slicker if the engineers available to remain on site and give a bit of a handover for when the ESP arrives. Because what we forget is at the end of all of these jobs is our customer, you know, and trying to make the process as slick and smooth so as everyone understands that they're on the same page, it would be great. So they are just minor amends and tweaking of a document because it wasn't fundamentally wrong in the first place. But it's just trying to learn from every iteration that goes out. It's trying to be an improvement on the last iteration. So there are a number of subtle changes in there.
And thank you very much for that, Dave. Trevor, from your side, I know, you know, as your role on things like the Standards Consultation Forum as well, you know, you obviously have an additional view on how some of those things feed in. Were there any particular changes or things that you were keen to see addressed in this edition, or, you know, that you knew needed to be tweaked and tapped from your side?
Yes, I think there was, because one of the biggest ones I think was what Dave's already alluded to, was reporting of RIDDOR and confirming, you know, that the situation needs to be unsafe to the extent where it could cause death, unconsciousness, or being taken to hospital. I think that's important, because all of these sorts of things will be relayed, from my point of view, be relayed back through, as I said, the Standards Consultation Forum, which looks at what the requirements are to make alterations to the ACS assessment process and GCS if someone does the GCS, and also now for training, which IGEM is heavily involved with also, as our the authorisers of the recogniser of training. So we make sure that the training also reflects the changes in the unsafe SITs. And I think that's vitally important. I mean, just little things which often are debated and disagreed about. And I'll just pick on one, just a very small one, because Dave covered most of the alterations. But one was around visual inspection. And there's always a massive debate around visual inspection. What exactly is a visual inspection? You know, we all might think, well, that's dead easy. You know, you just look to see, does it look like it's unsafe? Yeah, great. But do you pull the cooker forward? Do you actually pull it right out and pull it forward and make sure that everything's okay behind? And there's quite a bit of disagreement whether one does or not. We come to the conclusion that actually that isn't a visual inspection. That's not to say engineers don't have to do that. If they want to, that's fine. But actually, a visual inspection is a visual inspection. So that will be carried through to ACS and training. And that is very, very helpful. So the whole process of someone like me sitting on the panel is, I think, a great advantage. Very similar to, as we've said, having Gas Safe Register on and all of the info they bring through, and also Health and Safety Executive. It's a very good panel and it's quite wide ranging. So yeah, very good.
Useful. And Rob, from the register side, you know, were there particular bits that we're keen to see? Because again, technical helpline, that they often at the front line of you know, getting questions in from engineers, you know, seeking clarity on something, seeking a little bit of support for their decision making. Are there any particular bits in this iteration that you were, you know, that we were very keen to put forward, or you were very glad to see as part of this latest update?
Yeah, so there's a few bits there, Scott. So first of all, just to slip in there, the updates are available in the ISU 102. So that's the Industry Standards Update 102. Gives a list of the changes there. And that's available from our website. In terms of what we inputted in particular, there was the we get a lot of calls coming through to the technical helpline about grommets missing from boiler cases. Some manufacturers might say they're at risk, some might say they're NCS. There's a lot of debate about this, but it's fundamentally a breach in the combustion pathway. So we had a lot of discussion about this within the group. That's now in the tables, and you know, we classified that as at risk. But it is down to the engineer on site to make the final decision and to use all of the information available to him or her to assess the situation. And that might include talking to the manufacturers for further guidance as well. So yeah, some changes there. Plus, as Dave touched on, also the reporting of unsafe gas work to Gas Safe Register that does not meet the RIDDLE criteria. We do need to know about that. That can be done by logging onto the engineer's website and putting a notification through to us. We will follow up on that.
Super. And Ian, from an IGEM point of view, as the holders of the document, the ones who pulled it together, are there any particular standout points that you were keen to draw out from all of the panel members and the contributors to get across? I mean, there's always the knotty issues that are more difficult to actually solve than they sound that they should be.
There was a couple of things for me that were kind of standout. I mean, Dave's touched on the RIDDLE element, and certainly Trevor, when he touched on the visual inspection, were fairly key aspects of the fundamental revision. I think what was also quite a telling moment as well is actually going out for the public comment on the document last year as well was actually an excellent process that we rely on quite heavily when we're producing IGEM standards, and that was really welcome, so we can get wider engineers' views into what the panel of experts are saying. So it was pleasing to see that process. So it's quite a lengthy process, but it was very worthwhile.
Good. And just one last thing we wanted to have a look at was, we've had a sense of how, what the document is for, its kind of core purpose around here, how people and organizations can contribute to that to bring it through. Look at some of the key aspects that are in this update. Is it worth just another look at again, just to say how can engineers access it? Rob, I know you mentioned it's available on the Gas Safe Register website, but Ian, is it worth just a quick summary for how, the central purposes? I know the content itself is always freely available, and there's a number of formats that engineers can choose to go to their own touch points.
Yeah, very much so. Access through to IGEM's technical standards. If you go onto the website, you have access through to there, and it's freely available to download in a PDF format, as it's also available on the Gas Safe Register website. A couple of things to look out for coming in the beginning of March. There's the new printed edition by Gas Safety Book, a handy publication, which is an excellent document, and that will be available from the beginning of March. But look out for it. It's going to be launched with a new app as well, which will help bring it to life as well. So look out for that.
And that's it. That's all I think we really wanted to cover tonight. So just before we bring it to an end, I just wanted to thank the panel. So thank you to Dave, to Trevor, to Ian, and to Rob for giving us a little bit of insight on there. As we always do on these things, any comments that come in that where people are looking for a little bit more clarity, or where we as a panel think we want to put forward more detail, we'll always follow that up in Registered Gas Engineer magazine itself to have a look at. And again, we welcome all and any comments on there. But my thanks to the panel, and thanks to those who were able to join us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.